Good morning. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 this Wednesday morning, and just Paul is continuing his discussion on sexual issues. And if you recall, the last couple chapters, 5 and 6, deal with sexual immorality. And Paul is saying that sexual immorality has no place in the church. And as followers of Jesus, that we should be sex is between one man and one woman as husband and wife. And he gives a list of, it goes beyond sexual immorality, but sexually immoral, idolaters, adulterers, homosexuality, thieves, greedy, drunkards, revilers, swindlers. They really have no place in the church. But Paul says our job isn't to judge those outside the church, only those that claim to be a brother or sister in the church. So it's kind of the opposite way the church typically does things. We cast our accusations at society, and many times we allow things within the church to be okay. So Paul is saying, no, our concern is with those who claim to be a brother or sister within the church. And now Paul, in verse 7 says, now concerning the matters about which he wrote. So the Corinthians obviously wrote Paul a letter with some questions or concerns, and we don't have a copy of that letter. So we can just kind of try to piece together what it's about. But it's dealing with sex. Must be some questions on sexual stuff. And Paul talks about each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. So this view of marriage, and then he spends a lot of times just talking about that if you're single, it may be best to remain single, and that is certainly a good and viable option. But if you are not able to deal with the lust or the sexual temptation, then it is best to get married. So again, Paul's view of marriage, and I don't totally understand in verse 17, each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned him to. This is my rule in all churches. Verse 20, each one should remain in the condition of which he was called. Verse 24, whatever condition each one was called, let them remain in God. I get that when it's dealing with the circumcision or not being circumcised, or being a bondservant or not being a bondservant. And I don't know if Paul's trying to say if you're single when you're called, hey, it's great to remain single. If you're married, you need to remain married. I don't know. But he is saying throughout this chapter that single is certainly a great and viable option. And maybe in some cases is to be preferred. But if you cannot withstand the temptation, then it is best to be married. And verses, 4 and 5 are, I heard somebody this morning, I listened to a little blurb about this, saying very radical. Verse 4, at that time in that culture, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Totally acceptable, totally part of the culture. As a little girl, the father would have had authority, and that transitions to the husband having authority. So that would not have caused any discussion or dissension. But then the last part of verse 4, likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. That would have been absolutely radical at the time, that the husband not having authority, but the wife having authority over his body. So the guy said would have been almost earth-shaking and certainly highly, highly controversial. But Paul is stressing that in Christ, through marriage, and throughout the Bible we see it's leave, cleave, and become one. So through marriage, a husband and wife become one with each other. And the call that as we are followers of Christ to mutually submit to one another. And that we should not lord it over our wives, or our wives shouldn't lord it over our husbands, but we are mutually living this out as one. So just a radical teaching that we see in this chapter 7, dealing with some of the issues in the Corinthian church. But again, it's the push against sexual immorality that we've seen in 5 and 6, and this high regard of marriage in chapter 7, and this, that husband and wife are mutually submissive to each other sexually. We're mutually submissive emotionally within the same relationship, and it's just all under the leadership of Christ. That is the big thing, that husbands don't lord it over your wives, don't say, hey, you have to do this. Likewise, wives, that we mutually submit to Christ and to one another. So kind of hard teaching, and then, like I said, Paul's call that single is okay, but if you cannot withstand your lustful urges, then it's best to get married. So we'll continue with some issues tomorrow in chapter 8 of 1 Corinthians, and see some more things going on in the Corinthian church that hopefully we can apply to our lives. But I pray you have a great day, and may God bless you, and let me know if you have any questions.